Yes, he did.
Used to be recreational, but I know can act on that. My time when they served that kind of stuff. But anyway, yeah, good to see you. Well, from Astoria.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Jim.
I'm fine. How are you?
Good.
When did you?
You might mention it.
What's that?
He might tell you.
I didn't. I asked them.
And I have permits.
It's a good brand. It's a, it is watertight. It's a nice one. There's only 5 of this thing? Yeah, Reggie, told me. Huh?
I'm like, yes, like,
I was supposed to leave back.
I have it.
Drink out of this. Morning. Quality test.
Morning.
Morning. How are you?
Is that a 3-minute limit or what are we on? For open mic? 3 minutes.
Do you know?
Unless you're really looking for it, I'll ask you my question.
Somebody was like dying to know. I'm like, I don't know. He just wants a document.
So,
No idea. But I like, I wonder. Yeah, I actually had gotten it, but, and then it was like, oh, sorry, I don't have the information. I'm like, no, please follow, like, voicemails are hard. Like, I was like, today or no, and I was like, I found it, I found it. And like, every time I think, shake it all out, I know, yeah, so, emails, yesterday, I mean, what? Okay.
does everyone have a copy? No. Okay, so oh, so his letter encouraging us. Report how we were able to stay out of the sage grouse. You know, it's in the papers and news this morning about sage grouse plan has been changed in 5 states: Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Oregon. I think people are going to wonder, why are we not?
I said it to everyone.
Because we didn't want it. Yeah, that's in Montana. They were whining about it. Those were states that wanted more. We can, I'm going.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Finley. I'm the chairman of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. Today we have 5 commissioners with us. Commissioner Woolley is excused for personal business, as is Commissioner Biddle. So we do have a quorum. We're going to proceed with business. And we'll start with the director's report.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just before we start with reports, I wanted to mention that so today is our Pride Awards Day, where we recognize a number of employees for their great work in the field as well as in the office. And as such, irrespective of where we are on the agenda, we will have a hard stop at 11 a.m. to do the Pride Awards prior to the noon luncheon with same staff, which will be present as well. So,
Great.
just wanted to mention that. I also did want to mention that we have with us in the audience today Mr. John Turpinning, who is our legislative fiscal officer. He replaced Paul, who was our officer for literally over a decade. So we're happy to have John Turpinning here, as well as Allie Webb. She is our chief financial officer at the Department of Administrative Services Budget and Management program. So with that, we did provide field reports to you in written form. I would have Erica Kleiner come up to present the expenditure report. And while she's doing that, I will say that under other business, I am adding one item as well, and you all are aware of this now, but in addition to our proposed meeting dates for 2020, we're also going to have a discussion of refreshing the Commission's support for the Recovering America's Wildlife Act through resolution and signature by the chair.
Perfect.
So with that, Erica,
All
take
right.
it away.
Good
Thank
morning,
you.
Erica.
Chair Finley and members of the Commission, for the record, I'm Erica Kleiner, Deputy Director of Administration. So starting with the financial report, we are in the midst of a biennial changeover period right now. So the numbers that you have in the financial report aren't final numbers. We will have most of our revenue and expenditures booked within the next 2 weeks, so mid-August. But the formal accounting close isn't until December. So we'll have a more final report for you in September. In terms of cash balances, we're doing very well, continue to grow that. Growth has slowed down just a little bit, but we currently sit at $47 million for unrestricted cash, which is a very good place to be. In terms of revenue and expenditures, that looks really good too. We will take other funds and switch that over to general fund later in the process, so we'll use those appropriations. But as far as the other limitations, we're exactly where we should be. We don't spend that full limitation, but we want to be pretty close so we don't have excess limitation in our budget. Moving on to budget development, after my presentation, you'll hear from Management Resources Division staff. They're going to give you the details of the legislatively adopted budget. But for budget process, I will say that we're in that unique period of the budget process right now where we're very actively involved in 3 biennia. So we're closing out the 2017-19 biennium. We are setting up expenditure projections. We're defining our program priorities. And we're also about to kick off a process of planning for our agency request budget, which includes a request to include a habitat and conservation division. Internal audit update. So we've had an internal audit function for several years. That position, our internal auditor position, was vacant for several months. We were lucky enough to fill that on a permanent basis a couple months ago. And so that new internal auditor has worked through a risk assessment process and defined a 2020 year audit plan. So a couple of topics are pending right now for consideration is the primary topic for that audit plan. One of those topics relates to our prepaid coupon books. I think you guys heard about this as a potential audit topic a couple years ago. We would like to revisit that. And it's really looking at the controls that are in place because we have third-party vendors sell those licenses for us. And so we want to make sure that there's not opportunity for external fraud and no diversion of funding is taking place. And the second topic that the internal auditor is looking at for a more kind of exhaustive audit relates to our controlled hunt draw. And several other states have an independent third party look at the validity of that draw, look at the business logic of the draw, and just make sure and give credibility to there's not opportunity for error. We do have a new licensing system. We're working with a vendor that's relatively new to us. And so we believe it's error-free, but it would be nice to get somebody to look at that and tell us it is. Next, for internal audit, we had U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Title VI compliance auditors come for a kickoff meeting earlier this week. This week they did site visits, and they're really looking at ADA and accessibility issues at our facilities and sites. And they visited E.E. Wilson, they went to Lad Marsh and Sauvie Island. And so far that looks really good. We should get a report in the next 2 to 3 months. And then finally, I wanted to mention that our internal auditor recently completed a review of the internal audit function at the Oregon Youth Authority. So with internal audit, every 5 years, we look to another state agency to audit our auditor. So we also help other agencies do that. So he recently completed that, and we'll look to maybe Oregon Youth Authority as a partner agency to look at our processes in a couple years. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Mr. Buckmaster.
Thanks, Erica. I feel comfortable that we are on sound financial ground. To my fellow commissioners, I will tell you that the internal audit function has a representative from the commission on that committee, I guess it's called. And I've served that for the last couple years since the inception of the committee. It is a eye-opening experience. It's something that any commissioner would find satisfying and informative. And you all are sensitive, I think, to the issues of some of the things we do as a department and as a commission that we need to get them right. And if you have a concern, the internal audit is a great place to at least bring them up and say, are we going to pass? Are we doing this well? So our director, our chair, is going to look for somebody to replace me, and I would like to see all of you volunteer. It should be a hotly contested race on who gets to be on the internal audit committee. So there you go.
Big shoes to fill.
Yeah, 11th.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have a couple
Mary?
questions. And tell me if these should go to the next person instead of to you, but you mentioned the Habitat Division, and I think you mentioned budget notes. Could you say a little bit more about what came out of the legislative session on that?
Sure, Chair Finley and Commissioner Wall. We did not receive any budget notes out of session this go-around. But in terms of the new division, we first saw that come up in the governor's budget narrative, in which there was a statement in that narrative that said a new division was mandated. So we took that to the legislative process, and those folks asked us to wait until our 2021-23 agency request budget to bring that forward, which is what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. A couple more questions, actually. Is there new money or new work identified for climate change, just in general?
Chair Finley and Commissioner Wall, I think Management Resources Division is going to get into the details of the legislatively adopted budget. I don't know that there's money directly for climate change within ODFW's budget, but perhaps other entities that we work with.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Lappard.
Commissioner Lappard?
Thank you, Erica. I want to thank you for the work. I tried to follow a little bit for the legislative process, and it was very impressive. I think the department did pretty well this legislative session, particularly, I'm always concerned about general fund, and it's at 9%, which is still too low, but it's an 18% increase for a total increase of 7%. So that's pretty positive. I think you guys should feel real good about that. And
Committee, as a commissioner, as the commissioner representative, and so with him leaving the commission here in September, we will need a commissioner to participate in that. So I did want to make that pitch as well. I think Bruce did it far more eloquently than I am now. Nonetheless, I wanted to just reemphasize that. And then also, I did want to mention that the Fish and Wildlife Service Title VI audit that's underway right now, they just, as Erica mentioned, spent 3 days in the field. Typically, these are audits that involve, and they're not auditors per se, but these are audits that involve 2 or 3. More to come on that, but appreciate all the work from staff that keeps driving on these issues quietly without fanfare.
Okay.
That's all I had.
When are we going to talk about recovering America's wildlife?
We'll do that under other business.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. That's good. Okay. Anything else, commissioners? Erica, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Next up, we'll have an overview, and Commissioner Labhart jumped the gun a little bit. We'll have an overview of our legislatively approved budget from, I believe, Brandy Nichols and/or Matt Ader, or maybe both.
Commissioners, while they're coming up, if you'd like to work on the audit committee, let me know, or we'll draft someone.
Good morning, Chair Finley, members of the commission. My name is Matt Ader. Excuse me. I'm the Management Resources Division Administrator, and we're going to be discussing the legislatively adopted budget for the 1921.
Good morning, Chair Finley, Commissioners. For the record, I'm Brandy Nichols, our Senior Budget Analyst. So we'll start today with a recap of the 2019-21 biennium budget development process. As part of the department's budget development work, we held 2 external budget advisory committee meetings, one in March and one in May of 2018. To accompany those meetings, a series of town hall sessions were also held around the state during April of 2018. And the purpose of those town hall sessions were to seek public input on our proposed budget. Then at the June 2018 meeting, the Commission approved our agency request budget, and we submitted the department's agency request budget to the DAS Chief Financial Office at the end of August 2018. Near the end of November 2018, the governor's budget was released, and then our 2019 legislative session kicked off in January and concluded with the end of June. So during that time, we worked with our legislative fiscal office analysts to answer questions and provide information around our budget request. Near the end of the legislative session, the department's legislatively adopted budget was approved through both the House and the Senate, which brings us to now the final step in the process where our budget is pending final governor's signature. So today we will highlight for you the components of our 2019-21 legislatively adopted budget.
As Commissioner Labhart indicated when he was speaking, this is a good budget for ODF&W. Overall, a 7% increase in funding, a total of 19% increase in general funds, and 43% increase in lottery funds. I do want to point out on the lottery funds specifically, that really had to do with a fund shift from our general funds to lottery funds for a few of the packages that went through as part of the bill. Overall, though, it's a roughly $25.65 million increase from the 17-19 biennium to the 19-21 biennium. So overall, the budget is very positive.
So that's the department's budget numbers in total. Within those amounts are some specific items that we would like to review with you. So the department's budget bill, Senate Bill 5510, first of all, it includes an additional approximately $435,000 general fund for the fish division to restart summer steelhead production for the Santiam River system. Our budget bill also includes, as Matt just mentioned, some targeted fund shifts of around $1.8 million from general fund onto the department's license funds. Those fund shifts were done on through both the fish division and the wildlife division. Within the fish division, they were accomplished using personal services and services and supplies for both Bandon Hatchery and Nehalem Hatchery. That totals about $1.3 million of that fund shift. And then on the wildlife side, that was accomplished using, again, personal services and supplies within our interagency coordination program and some within wildlife management. And in the wildlife division, their total of the fund shift was around $550,000. Our budget bill also includes a one-time fund shift from general fund onto lottery funds. That total is around $1.7 million, and that was accomplished using personal services within the fish division's fish research and monitoring program.
Okay, for the end of session bill, House Bill 5050, there are a few items that we also want to point out. There was an increase of other fund expenditure for the operations of the Leesburg Hatchery, totaling about $1.35 million. Just as a note, policy option package 115 that was put forward was not approved. However, this is a attempt to address that particular pop. Also with the Leesburg Hatchery, there was a reduction in federal fund limitation of about $866,000. It was to align the budget of what funding we have and what funding we're going to use for the Lieberg Hatchery. Additionally, there was a $200,000 amount of money put forward for general fund for the use in the wildlife predator control program. And then the remaining pieces of 50-50 for the end of session bill are really administrative adjustments to the budget. It's where DAS has gone through, made adjustments to their either DOJ fees, the PERS fees, and then made a reduction. It's not really a reduction. They altered the limitation that we had for our approved budget to match the fees that they ended up truing up with their budget. So as they reduced their fees, it kind of reduced the need for us to have additional funding in our budget.
All right, the department's budget also includes some additional funding and positions related to some adopted policy bills. So the first of those is House Bill 2437, and that bill provides for permitting exceptions around maintenance activities in dry, traditionally maintained channels. So with that, the department will oversee the notification and review process and conduct site visits around that work. So this bill provides the department $202,000 general fund, which includes one permanent natural resource specialist 3 position to do that work, and their corresponding services and supplies. And this bill is also in that final step where it's pending final governor's signature. The next policy bill to talk about is House Bill 2574, and that involves an electronic public information system for shellfish. So this bill provides the department $160,000 general fund, which includes one limited duration natural resource specialist 1 position, along with the corresponding services and supplies to administer a community outreach program around opportunities for recreational shellfish harvesting. And again, this bill is also in that final step where it's pending final governor's signature.
The third bill is, House Bill 2829. This bill establishes the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund project. Essentially, the legislature provided us a opportunity for receiving or getting donations up to $1 million in other funds. Once that cap has been met, we can go back to the emergency board where an additional $1 million in general fund was authorized for expenditure. We'd go back to the E-board and make the request for the expenditure authority on both sets of money.
All right, now we'll move on to our policy option packages. So of the 28 that the department originally requested, 17 of those are approved and included in our legislatively adopted budget. This is essentially the same as what was included with the governor's budget, with a few additions that I'm going to now talk about for us in more detail. So the first of those is POP 116 around Willamette sea lion predation. So the department's original request was for both positions and services and supplies funding for sea lion removal efforts at both Willamette Falls and Bonneville Dam. The department has taken some internal measures to reprioritize existing staff to do some of this program work. So the package that is included in our legislatively adopted budget was modified to come in at a total of $493,000 general fund. And what that includes is one additional position to supervise that program and funding for monitoring at Willamette Falls, wildlife veterinary costs, and other services and supplies for the removal program. So the next additional package request is POP 127, our anti-poaching campaign. So this package includes a total of $3.8 million general fund. And of that, $2.3 million of that funding is intended for Oregon State Police to support poaching enforcement and outreach efforts. It provides for 4 trooper positions and 1 sergeant position, along with their corresponding vehicles and equipment. The remaining $1.5 million in general fund is for the department's Information and Education Division to develop a public awareness campaign to reduce poaching incidents. And this includes an additional public affairs specialist position, funding for a media campaign, along with some additional funding for the Department of Justice to assist local district attorneys with poaching prosecutions. The next one I'll talk about is POP 117, that's our additional wolf plan implementation. So the department's original request with this POP was to fund 5 positions to assist the department with fully implementing the wolf plan. The governor's budget included 3 of those positions funded with general fund and the remaining 2 positions to be funded with the department's license funding. The department decided not to pursue that, so the package was modified in our legislatively adopted budget to provide $702,000 general fund, which includes 3 positions and their corresponding services and supplies to do that work. And finally, the last POP I'll review for us is POP 114, the Oregon Conservation Strategy implementation. With this package, the department requested $1 million general fund, which included 3 positions and their corresponding services and supplies to research, monitor, and enhance the protection of at-risk species. This package request was included in the governor's budget, but as I'm sure you've noticed, it's not included in our legislatively adopted budget. So that is our review of our 1921 legislatively adopted budget. Does anyone have any questions we can answer?
Commissioner Lappert.
So again, a little bit premature, but thanks again for all your staff work on this. I was very impressed with the budget. I do have a question. It might be for Director Melcher because I've chatted with him a little bit about this. Toward the end of the legislative session, there was a lot of political pressure to fund Leeburg Hatchery. There was an assumption, I think, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, but there was an assumption from the Senate President's office that it might be funded out of general fund. It turns out it wasn't funded out of general fund, it was funded out of other funds, and I think that's license fees. So that wasn't really anticipated, those additional dollars to fund Leeburg. So in the future, how does the department see that playing out? And mostly my question has to do with potential license fee increases. And how did that all come together?
Sure. Chair Finley and Commissioner Lappert, I think in the short term, as we heard earlier from Erica, our cash flow remains strong. So in the short term, not an issue with moving that particular hatchery onto license funds. Longer term, though, the combination of Leeburg on license funds, as well as you heard described, I think, by Brandy, 2 other hatchery programs that were fund shifted from general fund to license funds. Those 3 programs now being on general fund will increase pressure on fish-related license revenues over the longer term. And so I think, it's premature now at this point to say, as we look at the revenue trajectories, but it increases the probability that we would need at least a fish license fee increase sooner rather than later. And by sooner, I mean in 2 years, as opposed to, I'm not talking about like immediately, but sooner rather than later, 2 years out versus 4 or 6 years out. So it increases that pressure on license revenue.
Okay, thank you.
A follow-up question to that,
Sure,
if
Mary.
I could. What did we actually commit to on Leeburg Hatchery in terms of length of time that the state's committed to funding it and that?
Chair Finley and Commissioner Wall, obviously every one of our budget is really just a 2-year commitment. So there's, I think, clearly amongst some constituents an expectation that that's going to go on in perpetuity, you would say. But at this point, it's really just a 2-year commitment. I don't expect the pressure to continue to fund Leeburg to go away, though. So I think it's much more likely a longer-term commitment.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice job. Appreciate it. Okay, what do we have next?
Okay, Mr. Chair, next up, and I do want to reiterate, it's been said by Commissioner Labhart as well as Matt and Brandy that this is really a good budget package for the department. I mean, it really is a good package. A lot of thanks go to, as I introduced earlier, our Legislative Fiscal Officer, John Terpenine, as well as our CFO, Chief Financial Office Analyst, Allie Webb, because they're doing all the work behind the scenes. And frankly, at least on the legislative side of a legislatively approved budget, our Legislative Fiscal Officer is really, he's very much in control of the budgets. And so our work with him and our appreciation for their work cannot be overstated. And a lot of that work is protecting our other fund from fund shifts, and we got a few of those, but overall, it's a very, very good package. So with that, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to have Dr. Dwayne Jackson come up, and I think there he is. He's going to give you an overview of our West Region Wildlife Research program. We have two wildlife research programs, one in the East Region, which is headed by Dr. Darren Clark, and then in the West Region, we have Dr. Dwayne Jackson that leads the West Region Wildlife Research. So wanted to get a little non-administrative flavor into some of these directors' reports. Dwayne, take it away.
Okay. Chair Finley, Commissioner, my name's Dwayne Jackson. I'm the Wildlife Research Supervisor for the West Region Wildlife Research Team. And I believe you've been given a little pamphlet that I put together that talks about all of the additional research projects that we're doing in the West Region. This morning I want to just give you a flavor of some of the more germane topics that we're working on currently. All of the research that we're currently working on is PR funded, which includes 75% of the funds are from federal dollars from the Wildlife Restoration Act, matched with 25% of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife license dollars. And we also receive some various grants from BLM and the Forest Service. What we're going to talk about this morning, I'll just a quick introduction to several of the topics. We've got 4 sub-projects in Blacktail Deer, 2 sub-projects for elk, and then a fisher occupancy study down in the southern part of the state. And I want to give you a few slides for each one of them. So we'll start off with the first project, which it came about as a more or less a request from our constituents when they were reviewing our Blacktail Deer management plan a few years ago. And they indicated that they would like to see the department obtain more biological information on blacktail deer, look at reproductive rates and the causes of poor recruitment, and to develop a census technique that would be giving us more of a precise estimate of the number of deer in Western Oregon. And so that's kind of the project censuses that we developed into to respond to our constituent groups. And so the first project started off in 2012, and we incorporated 2 Coast Range WMUs and 2 Cascade Range WMUs, the Trask and the Alsea in the Coast Range, the Indigo and the Dixon in the Cascade Range. And one of the things that really drives blacktail deer populations is the habitat characteristics that they're occupying. We wanted to try to distribute the blacktail deer across the landscape according to the habitat conditions that they were experiencing. Unfortunately, there's not any very wide landscape scale habitat model or map that we could utilize. And so what we had to do was to back up one step and go to the landowners. And so what we decided to do was to look at the landowner configuration in each of the WMUs with the assumption that the landowner would modify the habitat to their liking, and then that habitat would influence the blacktail deer populations. So we're a couple steps out, but we've categorized all of the WMUs according to a 10 square kilometer grid that we overlaid on each of the WMUs. So each 10 square kilometer grid is stratified into a particular landowner type. And then all of the data that we're collecting is based on that. So that we'll be able to relate that back, all the information that we collect back to a particular landowner and the underlying habitat. So the Trask WMU has a lot of varied habitat landowners in it. You can see each of those colors represents a different landowner. In the Alsea unit, we work primarily in the northern part of the unit, which is primarily a large private ownership. And then compare that to the Cascade Range WMUs, in which the lower elevations are again private land, but the upper elevations are predominantly federally owned property. All the tan that you see in both the Dixon and the Indigo units are federal property. So we started off in 2012 and started marking deer and trying to distribute these animals based on the landowner configuration within the WMU. Over the course of the 4 years, we radio marked 308 blacktail deer, 228 does with GPS collars, and then another 80 bucks. And each of those little dots represent a capture location of where that animal was marked. So you can see it was a considerable amount of effort because it's an extremely large landscape scale process to try to capture and distribute animals across the WMUs. Just to give you a quick feeling for it, as I mentioned in the Trask unit, there's a lot of different landowner individual properties, and so you can see the distribution of the deer, reflect that with different individual landowners receiving deer across the landscape, compared to the Trask and the Indigo, where the blue bars indicate the number of deer that were actually marked on federal property, which is a majority of those WMUs. One of the things that we're looking at, obviously, is the mortality of those animals that were radio marked. The first three on the left there are various things that happen to pretty much any of the wildlife across the state, vehicles, other things that happen, getting caught in fences, so forth, and some diseases. But the two main factors that influence our blacktail populations in Western Oregon are predation and humans. Predation primarily on adult does, which is the blue bar there under predation, and then humans under bucks, which is the orange bar under the humans. Most of that for bucks is legal harvest, but there is some poaching and other things going on additionally to that. So now I want to quickly jump to another project that we're working on that was recommended by our constituent groups to the Blacktail Deer Plan Management Review, which was trying to develop a census technique for blacktail deer in Western Oregon. So we started off looking at several different additional techniques other than the major spotlight survey technique that we currently use, and we ended up with fecal sampling and looking at a capture-recapture analysis of fecal DNA. So we started off with personnel collected samples. Each of those dots represent a personnel collecting a sample on the landscape. As you might imagine, it's very time-consuming, very intensive, and unfortunately we weren't able to acquire the number of recaptures on the deer that we required for good population estimates. And so we turned to conservation dog sampling. And so what you'll see in this slide is this blue outline is one of our 10 square kilometer grids that are across the landscape on each of the WMUs. And within that, we bedded a 9 square kilometer sampling grid with 9 1 square kilometer cells, all right? And so what happens is the dog and the handler course through each of these cells, all 9 of them, and they collect fecal material from blacktail deer, graded as to the freshness of the sample, and then provide that to us to take to the lab for DNA analysis. This particular process, you can step up on the analysis and you can actually obtain spatially explicit capture-recapture estimates for blacktail deer in each of these cells and for the 9 square kilometer grid, and then by extrapolation the 100 square kilometer grid, and by further extrapolation for the entire WMU. And so what it allows us to do eventually is actually make a population estimate with confidence intervals for the number of blacktail deer in our wildlife management units. So just to give you a feeling for some of the samples that we collected thus far, the landowner type is on the left, and the sampling nodes are just the places where sampling occurred, and then the number of samples that were acquired from each of those. You can see that there's a fairly reasonable association between the amount of sampling that you put on the landscape and the number of samples that are acquired from that landowner. Over the course of those 4 years, for the 4 WMUs that we were working in, we collected over 22,000 fecal samples. And all those samples have been analyzed. Anything that was fresh enough to provide DNA individual identification of the deer. Some naive density estimates from looking at just the initial blush of response from the individual deer from the sampling units, you can see these are the number of deer per square kilometer estimated for each of the landowner types. And it grades from federal properties, which have the lowest density of deer estimated for Western Oregon, up to our large private timber corporation properties that have the highest densities. Now, the new sampling technique, the spatially explicit stuff that we're getting into for analysis, will probably provide slightly different estimates. And so I wouldn't lock on to these individual estimates. They're going to be slightly different because this particular slide doesn't include any of the recapture data. The new stuff that we'll be analyzing here in the next 6 months or so will include recapture estimates and have confidence intervals on it. What I do anticipate is that the scale going from federal property with the lowest density to large private with the highest density will probably remain the same, regardless of the analytical technique that we use. The other interesting thing that we can get from blacktail deer fecal DNA is we can get the gender from those individuals. And right now, we're running about 55 bucks per 100 does, which is exceptionally higher than a lot of our other survey techniques. Most of our spotlight surveys come in about 20 to 25, maybe 30 bucks per 100. With the sampling technique that we're utilizing here is 55 bucks per 100. And the sampling is done in late spring, just prior to recruitment into the population. So it's got to be pretty close to what that population is experiencing. And the reason I bring that up is that next month at the big game meeting, those considerations will probably come up again about buck ratios and stuff for blacktail deer in Western Oregon. So one of the other projects that we're working on, again, a project that our constituent groups were very concerned about, was poor fawn recruitment of blacktail deer in Western Oregon. What I'd like to do is give you a real quick rundown of some of the stuff we're doing. We have a north study area, which is in the Dixon Wildlife Management Unit, and a south study area, which is in the Applegate MU down around Medford. We started this study in 2016 in the north study area, and then we followed it up last year in the Applegate WMU. Just a real blush of quick information. Births for blacktail deer in Western Oregon is essentially the month of June. We'll cover a majority of the reproductive effort for blacktail deer in Western Oregon. You can see that the Applegate is tending a little bit earlier in the year than the North Umpqua. It may be just sampling variation because we only have 1 year of data for the Applegate thus far. The main purpose of the research project was to look at the cause-specific mortality and survival estimates for fawns in our study areas. In 2016 to 18 for the Dixon WMU, we had 54% mortality of our fawns that we had radiomarked. The major cause of predation was bobcats in our study area in the north side. And then if you take that and extrapolate that mortality loss over a time period, if you start at the first day that a radiomarked animal was on the landscape and track mortality across time, at 79 days after the first fawn was marked, we have lost 60% of our fawns in the study area. And unfortunately, with that rate of mortality and the lower adult doe survival rates that we have in some years in the same study area, our blacktail populations will not be able to maintain themselves. Those populations, every time that happens with poor adult doe survival and high fawn mortality, that population is going to tend down just a little bit. In the 2018 data that we have for the Applegate unit, we again did everything exactly the same as much as we possibly could. And our highest cause of mortality was again predation, but bear were the highest cause of cause-specific mortality in the Applegate, with 71% mortality overall for the first year of the study. Another project that we're working on is with one of my graduate students, along with Dr. Katie Duggar from the Oregon State University, is we're looking at habitat use patterns and resource selection functions for blacktail deer in Oregon. The development of this project and the model that comes out of it will allow landowners, if they want to develop habitat characteristics or develop their landscape for black-tailed deer in the future, will provide to them the parameters that are most critical for black-tailed deer in Western Oregon. And as I mentioned earlier, the habitat really influences black-tailed deer, reproductive efforts, movements, everything. And so just to give you a feeling for what our deer are experiencing in Western Oregon, this particular slide is a single deer on federal property. And all those yellow spots are locations of that individual doe. And you can see that that individual doe is experiencing very high canopy closure forest, very little forage availability underneath, and very small home ranges, but very little availability of that animal to utilize forage that has been created on the landscape. Compare that to a large private habitat used by a doe in the Alc unit, for example. This individual doe used large conifer stands, but also spent a huge majority of her time in a clear cut where there is a lot of forage, grass, and forbs available for those animals to utilize. And then finally, a small private individual doe. You can see that this individual has quite a bit of a different experience dealing with roads, ATVs, vehicles, buildings, guns, people walking, and all kinds of stuff. But they do quite well, surprisingly, in small private. But the experience of those individual animals and the reproductive rate that each of these animals are experiencing across the landscape have to be partitioned by the landowner and the habitat that those animals are experiencing. And that's the reason for this project that we're going to develop the model for. I'm going to switch species on you real quick. Let's talk about Roosevelt Cattle elk. We've got a couple sub-projects on this. We started one project in 2018, this last year, with a helicopter capture in the McKenzie and the Tioga WMUs. And then those green dots on the map indicate where those animals were captured. We're combining this information with a district project in the North Umpqua district where they're capturing animals by traps and darting from the ground. But the whole process is to obtain information on radio marked elk so that during our survey periods we can direct survey methodologies from helicopters to the correct habitat and partition that and to partition the sampling protocol by habitat to increase our sampling results from the districts for habitat. And in addition to that, we're collecting a bunch of other information, including habitat use, mortality factors, movements, and a considerable amount of other information. Well, we started off quite well. We actually ended up with 33 animals radio marked in the two WMUs from our helicopter capture, but unfortunately, through a manufacturing error in our radio collars, there's screws that go into this little unit here and attach to the collar. Those screws were backing out of the collar, and the collar was dropping off from the elk in the field. We lost 13 of our 33 animals just like that. The collar fell off. We didn't get any data. And so we're hoping to be able to go back into the situation, reanalyze some of the data that's remaining, get as much as we can out of it, and potentially do this study all over again in the future with different collar designs, hopefully. But while they are working, they are providing us really excellent information. And you can see that elk in the Tioga unit, for example, are concentrating their efforts in clear cuts where there's a lot of forage available for them, and in dense canopy cover coniferous forest for probably security reasons. Elk are really an animal that requires a lot of nutrition all the time. They're eating machines, and so they have to be able to have high nutritious forage available to them. And I bring that up because this next study that we're going into, we utilize that information to partition the sampling protocol for elk. and that is another fecal DNA study. The intent was to find out, can we, as an agency, collect elk fecal DNA at the same time that we're doing blacktail deer fecal DNA, get density estimates for both of them. And so Dr. Whitaker, myself, and Dr. Epps from the university pulled in a graduate student, and the graduate student is working on this study currently, and we hope to be able to provide a protocol for sampling elk at the same time that we're doing blacktail deer sampling for density estimates. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do was to supplement the fecal DNA density work with our habitat work from the radio collars. So we're working in the same WMUs as where the radio collars were put out in the McKenzie and the Tioga. And so here, as I mentioned, elk are eating machines. And so what you really have to lock into for sampling protocol is the amount of forage available to them on the landscape. And so what we did is we combined the landowner characteristics and DDE, which is the dietary digestible energy available on the landscape. And so from that, there's 12 different categories across the landscape, and you can see the sampling protocol that we utilized. In this process, we just used technicians to sample the cells that were selected from the sampling, and then they collected fecal DNA just like we do for the blacktail deer. In 2018, we surveyed 36 cells, individual cells, 10 on federal, 16 on private, 10 on state-owned property. We collected 542 elk samples, and those samples generated 122 unique IDs across the landscape, 27 males, 81 females, and then 14 of the samples that were sufficient to actually give us an individual animal. They didn't amplify at the DNA marker or at the gender marker, and so we weren't able to tell whether they were male or female, but we did know that they were an individual animal. We got 41 recaptures from the sampling, and so that's going to allow us to make fairly decent estimates for the Tioga. In the McKenzie, it appears that there's fewer elk or that they're occupying habitat that we didn't survey. We sampled more cells, 43 cells, 23 on federal, 20 on private, and we ended up with only 24 unique individuals. And we had about the same recapture rate, about 33% of the animals were recaptured. We repeated this study again this year. We don't have the data yet back from the DNA lab, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to give you a little bit more detail on how this process is going to work into the future. Just as a quick kind of a qualitative estimate of where the technicians were finding the samples. When they collected a sample, they looked around and qualified the habitat that they were in. As you can see, the distribution, most of the samples were collected from open forest, which is usually a clear cut, older age clear cut that is starting to grow up into maybe 10, 15-year-old repot. And then a lot of them in clear cuts, and then as you get into the more advanced age structure of the forest, the amount of sampling decreases and the sampling stayed the same, but the number of samples recovered from that sampling decreased. So finally, a study on fishers in the southern part of the state. The intent of this study was to get some information for management purposes for the agency for future recommendations to the Endangered Species Act, wherever this species might end up in the future. I contacted some folks that were already doing some fisher work in California, the Oregon State Institute for Natural Resources, and we combined our efforts in with that group of people. So right here is the sampling sites across southern Oregon. Right there is the California-Oregon border. And the Oregon State study has been going on for about 10 years now, and they have 100 sites. Most of them are actually in California, but they did have 18 sites up in Oregon that they were surveying at the same time. And so the intent of our study was to expand on this study to get more information on the Oregon side of the border. And so what we did is we put in another 50 sites, expanding our sampling protocol, the same protocol as what has been carried on in the past for the California study from Oregon State to the north and a little bit to the west of their sites in Oregon. The sampling is totally non-invasive. It starts off with a little cubby, if you will, that has chicken legs and cat food in the back of it. And so that attracts the fisher into the box. And this device right here is a wooden lathe, very high-tech, that has a sticky strip on the bottom of it, kind of like a fly strip. And so the fisher will go into the box, kind of crawl underneath the board, and as they do, they rub their back on it and leave hair. And so then we take that hair, send it to a lab, get DNA results, and it's the same process that we were using for blacktail deer. In addition to that, there's a track plate in the bottom of the cubby that is covered with toner, ink toner from a cartridge. You just dump it out on there. They walk in there, they leave a negative impression in the ink. They walk a little bit farther, and then there's a sticky pad in front of the track plate, and then they step on that, and it leaves a positive impression of the ink that was on their feet. And so we get track information and hair samples from the same device. And so very quickly, some of the results that we've got from the 2017 and 2018 sampling, a whole suite of species from the WMU down in the Applegate Unit. Quite a bit of gray fox in that unit, and obviously our species of concern were fisher. And we ended up with 38 fisher samples in 2017, 24 samples in 2018. Send all those fisher hair samples to the lab. And we're using exactly the same lab as the California Oregon State study. And so they have a lot of history, genetic history on animals in the region. And so what we did is we take those samples, have the DNA results come back, and the results so far have indicated that in 2017 we ended up with 14 unique individual fisher in our portion of the study, and in 2018, 11. You can see the male and female distribution from those animals. What's interesting is the high percentage of males in the population, and I'll address that in just a minute. If you take this information from the DNA results and run it through, again, a spatially explicit model, you can actually generate density estimates for fisher in the study area. And as it turns out, our current estimate is 27 fisher for the Oregon study area, which is 12 fisher per every 100 square kilometers, or for our study area, which is 222 square kilometer area, or about 5 males and 7 females for every 100 square kilometers. So this incorporates all of the information for that general area. And you can see that these estimates, the female fisher density is higher than what we're experiencing in our study area. And so the question is, why does the overall population have a lot more females than what we're experiencing? Well, it probably comes about to how the recaptures are stacking up in the sampling. So in 2017, those yellow spots are where we got fisher samples. And you can see a fairly even distribution across the entire study area. And then in 2018, we had sampling, but it was almost all restricted to the northern portion. We lost, if you will, individuals captured in the southern part of the study area. And so the question is, did those animals not respond to the sampling protocol? Did they die? Did they move on? And so one of the things that we hope to be able to do is, with the database that we currently have from the 10 years of work and the study area that we're working on right now, is build up this population of known IDs and be able to track individuals across time and actually get a survival estimate that's totally non-invasive from just the DNA work. But speaking of whether those animals are actually still on the landscape or not, we did have 2 recaptures in the very first year of study. And you ask, well, how did you get a recapture from the very first year of the study? Well, it turns out that those 2 males actually came from the portion of the California study that had been done previously by the Oregon State University. And so what appears to be, and this is speculation, is that this population that we have currently in Oregon is higher male dominated, and it may be from males dispersing into Oregon from the other major portion of Fisher in California and Oregon. And so males are known to probably disperse farther and more frequently than females, and so we're getting more males up here in Oregon than what you would anticipate if that population was an established population. Again, speculation, but we really don't know for sure. Quick little video for you to show you how the sampling protocol works. So this is a Fisher experiencing our sampling device. So it approaches the cubby, smells the bait in the back of it, goes in. Sorry. And right there, he leaves hair on the sticky strip and gets toner ink on his paws, goes in, grabs the chicken, turns completely around in the box, comes back out, leaves more hair on the sticky strip, and then takes off. And so with that, I'll end my presentation and try to answer any questions that you might have.
I have a couple.
Okay, go ahead, Mary.
Thank you for the report. That was really interesting. Could you re-say the sentence from the first study of why you did it? What, at the end of the day, what are you going to use it for?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall, the Blacktail Deer Management Plan went out to a group of constituents that evaluated what the agency had planned to do in the future for blacktail deer management in Western Oregon. One of the topics that came back almost without fail from all our constituent groups was that they wanted basic biological parameters for blacktail deer in Western Oregon. There's very little information available on reproductive rates, survival rates, habitat use, mortality factors, essentially everything on blacktail deer that population responds to, whether it grows or declines or stays stable. We don't have information, or very limited information. The study was designed to answer most of those questions. The radio color study is designed to answer the biological parameters, mortality, movement rates, habitat use. The density fecal DNA study is to answer the number of deer on the landscape, and then the fawn mortality study is obviously to address fawn recruitment.
The second question I have is, when you talk about constituent groups, are you talking about hunters, landowners, public, informed public? Who are your constituent groups that shape that?
Commissioner, when we issued the Blacktail Deer Management Plan, we actually established 4 constituent groups that were allowed to pull in any individual that was from that community that was interested in blacktail deer management in Western Oregon. It included hunters. It included conservation constituent groups. It included the Forest Service. It included BLM. It included other biologists from other agencies. everybody that wanted to comment on the agency's blacktail deer management was included in those groups. There were 4 groups across Western Oregon, and the response from those groups were written reports to the agency on their recommendations for blacktail deer management in regard to the blacktail deer management plan.
Thank you.
Commissioner Spilbrink.
Yeah, great report. The question I had was on the, again, on the mortality of the black-tailed deer there. You had the adult doe mortality from predation. Did you have that broken down to what the predators were on that?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Spilbrink, a majority of the predation on adult females is cougar.
That's what I would have guessed. I just wanted to know that for sure. Thank you.
Commissioner Buckmaster and then Commissioner Lappert.
Thank you, Dwayne. One of the questions that I believe I've been asked the most in my tenure as commissioner is how many cougars do we have in Oregon? And when I give them a number, the second question is, oh, that's not right. Do you really believe that? So I read with interest the study on the estimation of cougar density using DNA, and when I got to the end of it, I was going, well, that doesn't look that good. So, are you going to be able to come up with something that's going to make it easier for us commissioners to answer that question? How many are there? And when they say, do you really believe that, we'll be able to say, yeah, well, sure.
Chair Finley, Commissioner Buckmaster, the intent is yes, to give you another analytical technique to estimate cougar densities in Oregon. The agency's gone through several different scenarios of how many cougars there are in Oregon using all kinds of techniques. Predator-prey models, population models. Actually, fecal DNA has been used in the Northeast, and there's a publication out by some of our staff on density estimates of cougar in Northeast. The information that we're utilizing in Southern Oregon is to help substantiate whether our zone-wide density estimates that are currently available to the public to look at is how close are those estimates to being proven by fecal DNA estimates on the landscape. The intent is to actually get excellent density estimates with confidence intervals on those estimates. The process that we're currently using really relies on our volunteer houndsmen that are helping us collect the data. At this point, the number of recaptures that we're experiencing is pretty minimal, and so our confidence intervals will probably be quite large, which is really unfortunate. It's a small project that we haven't devoted hardly any personnel time to. It's all being done through volunteers primarily.
Thanks.
But I would like to expand on it.
I think, and Chair Finley, I think not next month, but in Ontario in October, we're going to have Dr. Clark to give a similar overview of the East Region research. And I think Dr. Clark's been doing a lot of cougar-related as well as wolf-related work. So you'll probably hear more about it. Commissioner Buckmaster, you'll be welcome to watch it live streamed.
I will.
But we'll get more of that discussion.
Commissioner Lappert.
Dwayne, thank you for your presentation. It was very, very interesting to me personally. So it's just a comment. It's a little bit disturbing to me that when you were talking about the fawn survival, and I'm worried about that. So did you have enough information with your research to draw any conclusions that would lead toward potential hunter restrictions, hunter numbers for deer? And in particular, I'm interested in the deer populations in Western Oregon. Says because research drives facts, and facts drives what the commission would do with, allowing hunting or not allowing hunting, or numbers of hunters, those kind of things. Do you have enough information from this study to draw any kind of conclusions for Western Oregon?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Lambert, The number of tag allocations and hunting pressure and stuff for blacktail deer in Western Oregon has very little impact on fawn recruitment rates. The critical component for recruitment rates for fawns, particularly in Western Oregon, has to do with the doe nutritional status. When she gives birth, is she able to maintain that fawn? Is the fawn born in good condition? And whether she, as a doe, can nurse that fawn to be recruited into the population. None of that has to do anything with hunting pressure. It's all about the forage availability and the nutritional condition and body condition of the does as they go into breeding season and raise that fawn. And that's why we have concentrated on the habitat parameters in Western Oregon and which ones are most critical. And that was kind of the reason for looking at the resource selection function model that we're currently working on at Oregon State, is to really define what components on the landscape are critical for blacktail deer and survival. And if we have good forage and a lot of it that's available to all the deer, fawn survival rates will probably increase. Now, hunting pressure, tag allocation, number of doe tags, all influence the distribution of the harvest, but it's primarily on bucks. And truthfully, bucks really don't mean anything to the population as far as projections into the future. It's all about does and their survival and the fawn recruitment rates.
And habitat.
And habitat,
Yeah.
which is the driving factor.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's admirable. Thank you, Kurt, for bringing this forward, and Dwayne.
Yep.
I would remind us to look up there and think about that we have a non-game responsibility in addition to what we do for game. And this DNA has a wonderful opportunity for us to know how many species we have in relation to predator-prey relationships and everything else. So it's promising and good leading work. I have a couple of questions. When you were given the densities on specific types of habitats,
Right.
and it was old clear cuts or newer clear cuts, in Southern Oregon now we have a lot of emphasis on prescribed burns. And as I remember my Yellowstone days, we did a huge amount of post-fire research. And one of the things we found is the protein in herbaceous plants after the fires shot through the roof. So the bioenergetics are interesting in terms of, is that something without breaking the bank, we could make a correlation between the protein or the other nutrients in these plants between a controlled prescribed fire and some of these other habitat types?
Chair Finley, that is a very real possibility. It would take a whole new study, however.
Yeah, no, I understand.
And the 4 WMUs that we currently worked in really don't have any of those larger landscape burns that we could have investigated. And I can tell you that current research also substantiates the information that come out of some of the older literature where after a prescribed fire or a lighter burn on the understory really increases the 4-H capability, not only in content, but in palatability for ungulates. And it would be an excellent study that we could probably incorporate into, right now, into the Applegate Unit, because I didn't mention it, but it may be in the little brochure that I handed out. We've expanded the blacktail deer study into 2 more WMUs, the Tioga Unit right west of Roseburg, and then the Applegate Unit down around Medford. The Applegate Unit has had a couple fires in the last few years that right now we have deer on the landscape that are using or very close to those fires. We could easily manipulate that so that we could get forage data from that.
It was just an interesting aspect to me. I did want to comment on the Applegate Unit. That's part of where I grouse hunt. And I also hear automatic weapons and all kinds of plinking going on. So if you want to know maybe where some of your animals disappear, it's some of our better citizens. Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Dwayne.
Thanks, Chair Finley. I guess I would just add maybe a little bit of additional context. I think when you look at Blacktail deer management in particular, it's not been a precise science, and I think we all know that, we all recognize that. But over the years, historically, surveys were conducted with survey routes, typically through clear cuts or recent clear cuts, spotlighting. Well, the landscape has changed, as Dwayne mentioned, in particular on the federal lands. So one of the common things we used to hear, we don't hear it quite as much anymore, but was that there's no deer. The black-tailed deer are all gone. There's no deer. A lot of these new techniques that Dwayne's using, as well as trail cameras, are really showing that actually the deer aren't gone. They're just a lot harder to see.
They're in my backyard.
Mine too. So there is value just in that, and it does set the stage. We're doing the groundwork for better and more scientific management in the future. So, thanks, Dwayne.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Thank you for the
Appreciate it.
opportunity.
Thank you.
That concludes the director's report, Mr. Chair. Next, we have public forum, and we have about, I guess we have 5 individuals signed up for public forum. The first is a duo, Mr. Dave Wiley, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and Bill Richardson, also the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. They want to talk with you about partnering for wildlife with the Department of Fish and Wildlife.
All right, thank you. We have the Dave Wiley and Bill Richardson. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. We've allocated for each of our speakers 3 minutes apiece, so would you see the red light? Please wind up your remarks.
We'll be quick.
We don't charge you for your name and address as you introduce yourself. We don't start the clock then.
Okay.
All right.
I'm Dave Wiley, sir. I'm a volunteer for Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and I've been here before, as you know. With me today is Bill Richardson, the Senior Lands and Program Manager for Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. And just quickly, our mission is habitat. The mission statement actually says Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation mission is to ensure the future of elk, other wildlife, and I emphasize other wildlife, and their habitat and our hunting heritage. We have about 235,000 members nationwide, 17,000 members in Oregon, 500 chapters nationwide and 25 in Oregon. We're a 501c3 chartered organization, and our headquarters is in Missoula, Montana. And our principal funding source is produced by our chapters. Bill, it's your nickel.
Chair Finley, Director Melcher, and members of the commission. I'm Bill Richardson. I'm the Lands Program Manager serving Oregon and Washington for the Elk Foundation. And my primary focus is on permanent land protection. But I kind of want to give you an overview of some of the things that we do and emphasize the partnership that we enjoy with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Virtually every project that we work on is in conjunction with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Any lands project that I bring forward starts with with ODF&W. All of our project advisory committee projects, it's got the unfortunate acronym of PAC, but that's how we fund habitat enhancements, research, and management in the state of Oregon and across the West with our PAC program. Every one of those projects requires a letter of approval from the local ODF&W biologist. So we're joined at the hip, and virtually everything we do is under the auspices of ODF&W. We do have quite a few partnerships. In addition to ODF&W, we work with state and federal agencies and private landowners to enhance habitat for elk and other wildlife. We also work with a variety of other NGOs, including OHA, the Mule Deer Foundation, National Wild Turkey Foundation, and the Oregon chapter of the Wild Sheep Foundation. We also collaborate with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And we do engage in a lot of research activities. We fund research through OSU, the USDA Pacific Northwest Research Station, and especially the Starkey Forest and Experimental Range. And currently we're co-funding with ODF&W a position at Starkey to go over their metadata and make that metadata from years of collaring efforts and telemetry so that that's widely available and more easily used for a variety of research needs. So pretty cool stuff with Starkey and ODF&W again. We've given you a packet. I'm not going to go through everything, but I just want to point out a few things. We've got a national spreadsheet or a national program overview. The map on the back of this, I think I like to say is kind of a map of elk country, if you will. Our project activity is focused on elk country. I've given you the mission dashboard, which is through the second quarter of 2019, so it kind of gives you a good snapshot of where we're at. And then I've given you the Oregon project history summary. And again, the back of that has a map with all our project activity, our lands activity, our chapters. And I do believe that that is a good mirror of elk country in Oregon as well. I do want to point out that this last year in January, the Oregon PAC approved $355,000 in funding across Oregon. About 18 counties, so over half the counties in Oregon, received some PAC funding, and a wide variety of projects, including some research, a collaring effort in Umatilla County. So, and we are currently engaged on planning efforts in Umatilla County to address some elk depredation issues and elk distribution issues. So that's going to continue. I also provided you our entire Oregon project history, and I've got a summary on the top of that so that you can see what we've done across the state. And then I just want to point out a few projects here. So focus, the first few pages are actually funded through state grants. That's another bucket of funds that we have available. And we've been spending about $45,000 a year on state grants. Those funds go to conservation education and hunting heritage programs. So those first couple pages are with that. Those grants are actually volunteer administered and voted on. So it kind of augments our PAC, plus gets some money out on the ground, especially focusing on youth. And we have also focused on disabled hunter opportunities. So in permanent land protection, I've given you a few flyers. Our recent Hurricane Creek acquisition over by kind of between Joseph and Enterprise, and that kept that ground open. There was a development scenario on that where an outfitter was going to put in a horse packing lodge and run pack trains up and down the mountain, which would have irrevocably altered that whole landscape. And if you've ever been to Telluride, that was my fear of having those horse trains going up and down the mountain and making basically habitat unavailable and access unavailable to hunters and backpackers on the most heavily used trails in the Eagle Cap wilderness. I've also included the headwaters of the John Day River. That was a large acquisition, over 13,000 acres. And we worked with the Forest Service and the D.R. Johnson family to acquire and convey that to the Forest Service. Again, that was directly in conjunction with ODF&W, and in fact, ODF&W fisheries biologists provided crucial data on that was the other wildlife component of that project was fish, salmon, steelhead, and bull trout. And without that data from ODF&W, we would have never been able to bring that project to the finish line. The final one I've got is the South Basin Springs acquisition. This was in addition to the Murderers Creek, to the Philip Schneider Wildlife Unit, and the other wildlife component on this was actually mule deer. So we do we're working on elk, we got to focus on elk, but everything we do has other wildlife component as well. And then the final handout, I do want to emphasize that we have volunteer projects on the ground, and we've got an active team, our mission team, and they're running projects throughout the state. We just finished an effort at our summer rendezvous in Logan Valley, about 60 volunteers. We built nearly a mile of buck and pole fence and rolled up wire on another mile of old 4-wire fence and repaired some exclosures on aspen. So a great effort. And again, ODF&W was there with us all the way. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You still have some unexpired time, Bill, if you want.
Although we do not, sir, engage in political activity, we do advocate for reasonable, prudent, and science-based wildlife management, and we work with you, the department, at the legislature, among other places, and of course, we've been before you with respect to various management plans. And I think that would conclude it. Bill, have you got anything?
Pretty much. I would like to thank Dave, and Dave's had a huge presence for us with the commission and with the legislature. We recently recognized Dave's effort with the Elk Country Legacy Award. So, and again, we appreciate our partnership.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Lappard. And then-
So, Dave and Bill, I just want to thank you. Land protection and access, hunting and conservation outreach, and habitat stewardship. I'm proud to say I'm a member of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and I appreciate the work that you do. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Spellbrink.
Yeah, I've been a member for a long time, big fan too, Rocky Mountain Health Foundation, and just mentioned that the magazine Bugle, what a great resource that is, and you don't need to be a hunter to really enjoy that magazine. I'd recommend anyone that has a chance to pick up the magazine and read it.
Absolutely, and much appreciated. I would like to point out that we have a lot of material available on at rmef.org as well as Elk Network. We kind of replaced our TV channel. We're not doing that anymore, but we are doing video on Elk Network, so visit that too.
Okay.
Sir, may I point out where you can get the link? Oh, addresses are important these days. Don't misspell them. But the link is www.rmf.org and Elk Network, and it appears on the last page of the news release about this year's habitat projects.
Okay.
And Mr. Chair, I would also just like to echo my appreciation and support for the foundation, all the work that we do in partnership, but also for Dave Wiley. Dave is one of our he's a member of our army of unpaid lobbyists at the Capitol, engages with us regularly on a number of issues. You know, we don't always agree on everything, but that's fine. We still work well together. And Dave is also a member of our External Budget Advisory Committee, long-standing member of that committee, and hoping that he continues here through this next budget development process as we talk about reconstituting the Habitat Conservation Division.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right,
Thanks,
thank you,
Bill.
gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Next up, Mr. Chair, under public forum would be Jim Wells. Mr. Jim Wells, President of Salmon for All, wants to talk with you about Columbia River fisheries reform.
Good morning, Jim.
Yes, good morning, Chair Finley and Commissioners. Jim Wells from Astoria, a gill netter, and I represent Salmon for All today. And I'm here to talk about Columbia River fisheries reform. So reading the bios on the Commission webpage, I see that almost all of you are from rural areas. I know you realize that any economics are very important and appreciated to rural people. The Kitzhopper plan came about following the defeat of the gillnet ban Measure 81 in 2012, and we have been suffering under this plan ever since. The Washington Department came out with an executive summary of the plan, and all I have time to do is just read you the conclusion. There's a lot of good information in it. The large economic benefits for both commercial and recreational fisheries expected from the policy were not observed during the implementation period. Commercial select area enhancements and alternative gear development have not replaced mainstem fisheries. Recreational fisheries have only seen marginal benefits to changes in allocations. The expectations in the development of the policy were not met. We were removed from the mainstem Columbia River with enhanced select areas and new alternative gears to make up for the lost economics. If that didn't work, adaptive management was built into the plan. The purse seine and beach seine has been a failure because of bycatch and high release mortality rates. If you look at in the handout I gave you, there's a real interesting piece here. It's a history of the trap in the Columbia River. And I don't have time to go through it, but if you go to the back page at the very top, from 1927 to 1934, this is a history. Inclusive, the traps accounted for 15.2% of the Chinook salmon catch and almost 35% of the steelhead catch. And the habits of the fish have not changed. They're still traveling the beach today, and so they are very susceptible to the trap. I gave you a select area handout, and this was supposed to replace the main stem. And you can go down through it. This is right from the state. I just got it a couple days ago from the department. And you can see with the 19 catch is the second worst out of the last 20 years for spring Chinook. For coho, it's the second worst out of the last 30 years. And for fall Chinook, second to the last in the last 17 years, or third worst out of the last 17 years. So obviously the selects are not making up. The Washington Commission passed a Columbia River reform policy in early March that provided a chance for Oregon to vote and to get concurrent on the regulations with Washington. For various reasons, that vote has not happened. Now, commissioners that went through the process with us and knew the issues, they are now terming out without voting on adaptive management and leaving you new commissioners to deal with it. Looking ahead, there's nothing on any Oregon Commission agenda through 19 that mentions Columbia River reform. We have basically lost our fishery and the economics it brought to our communities with minimal, if any, gain for the sport fishery. We are left wondering, what's your plan to make this right and fair? What's the path forward? Our rural communities need your help. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I was just glancing at page 173, the last one on Hall seines, and the history from 1934 going forward and even reflecting back to 1882. And then it describes how the seines have evolved over time. So I understand the difference that has been indicated with beach seines and some of the other adaptations. What's the difference between these historic seines that were used, I guess, no one was telling them they couldn't use them, and today's?
A lot of the technology, there's a diagram in this thing that shows a seine, a setup, the lead, and the pot and the spiller and everything else like that. It's basically, I think technology is basically pretty much the same. So I brought you, if I was going to get questions, I wanted the opportunity to show you the difference in the gears for what we use and the seine, and I'll leave this with you guys. If you look at that diagram, it shows the lead from the beach. That is made of material like this. This is about a 3-inch mesh. And like I said, when there's sockeye and steelhead traveling the beach, this is what they come up against that funnels them over into the trap. Here's the gear we fish. When it's hung, the meshes are open like that. This is a big mesh gill net. I'll leave this with you guys to look through. If you were a sockeye or a steelhead traveling through on your way upriver, I think you'd rather run into this than this. And
So is that like a 9-inch?
that's a 9-inch. Big mesh is a 8 and 9-inch, and this is a 9. And 8 is considered big mesh as well. We use that in the fall, and sometimes 8-inch in the spring when we had access to the Columbia, which under this plan we really don't anymore, except for a real limited time in the fall in zones 4 and 5. As far as the traps go, I'm sure they have done some things to try to change, but I have some catch data here. If you'd be interested, I have some catch data on the most recent, this is the most recent data from the state. And kind of exemplifies what I was telling you about this for a lead. The trap started on May 5th and it went through July 3rd. So it ran for about 40 days. And total Chinook caught was 137 Chinook. And that's only about, 3 Chinook a day is all it caught. And of those 137, they're not all sellable fish because there's wild fish in there that's supposed to be released, and only a portion of that 137 would be sellable. Steelhead, 251, sockeye, almost 900. And it was supposed to be set up this year for a shad catching opportunity. It caught 357 shad out of a run of 7.5 million that went by. So it was pretty good at catching steelhead and sockeye, not very good for Chinook. So the economics of it for us would be nil. That's the bad part about it. You got handle of endangered fish, that's the side of it, and also it's got to produce economics to be commercially viable, and it has not done that.
Commissioners, other questions?
I have one. Jim, could you talk a little bit about where the pound nets fit in all of this? We've heard some about them as well.
Well, this is the pound net.
Okay.
The trap is the pound net. They're the same thing.
And so in terms of how much of the solution that is, how would you answer that?
I think that fish trap or pound net, as it's called, would be good as a research tool. If it was operated like it is now, it's operated under a subsidy or a grant. It can't be self-sustaining with those kind of economics. So it could be used for tagging fish and releasing them, research, but I don't see it fitting into down the road. I think it's going to go down the seine road as the seine and the beach seine. But I don't see it fitting into the commercial fishery.
I have one more question.
Sure.
This is a general question, and most of us don't know how to answer it, so I wouldn't be surprised if you can't either, but I'd like you to try if you will. And that is, you look at this and say that the plan hasn't worked. If the wild fish were sitting next to you and they had a voice, they'd probably say the plan hasn't worked. Now we have climate change and all of its impacts as well. So how do you look at this differently now than earlier? Or what do you do in the face of climate change and including those impacts in this discussion?
I think with climate change, and I know as a gill net fisherman, and probably with this shad, all the shad that went by, the fish are David Moskowitz is going to talk about cool water refugia coming up next, I think. But the fish are gravitating towards the deeper water, bottom of the channel when they're transiting. That's probably why they didn't catch any shad. And but steelhead, for some reason, steelhead and sockeye still want to travel the beach. And in the fall, Thule Chinook salmon do the same thing. They're lazier fish than upriver bright. They don't want to fight the current, so they get tight onto the beach where it's slacker water to travel. Yeah, climate change is definitely a big problem for all of us, and it has affected the fish. And like I said, I just see them gravitating more towards the cooler water and sticking more to the main channel.
Commissioner Spellbrink.
Yeah, I did some personal research on, I know of an individual that spent quite a bit of time and energy and a lot of money to try and make the fish trap work, and he said one of the big problems was the sea lions, of course, the predators. The sea lion predator was just eating the fish up too, so, you know, I think that's probably one of the problems with anything like that.
Okay. Thanks for coming, Jim.
Thank you very much.
Bringing the nets, as we
I'll leave those and Bruce can collect them for me.
Okay.
I would also like to thank Commissioner Buckmaster. I guess this is his last meeting. And we all certainly wished he would have got another term, but that didn't happen. I think he's been a very fine commissioner, and we want to thank him for his service.
Thanks, Jim.
You aren't the only one that wishes that he were going to stay with us.
Thanks, Jim.
Yes, thank you, guys.
Mr. Chair, next up is Mr. David, not Davis, David Moskowitz to talk about Columbia and Snake River fish conservation issues. Yeah. I almost read it too.
Maybe before the clock starts, I'd just like to, I'll introduce myself, David Moskowitz with the Conservation Angler, and we'd also like to thank Commissioner Buckmaster for his time. We're glad he's going to continue on at OWEB, where you can, your energy and inquiry will be well used there, and we appreciate your service. And also just like to welcome Commissioners Labhart. Nice to see you on board. So thank you. Chair Finley, members of the Commission, Director Melcher, David Moskowitz with Conservation Angler, and I'm here to speak to you about protective regulations regarding recreational angling within and adjacent cold water refuge areas that exist in the Columbia and actually throughout other rivers in Oregon. I provided a document that talks about the run status of the 2019 salmon and steelhead coming up to Columbia. It's interesting to note that between when the beginning of the summer fish start April 1st through August 1st, there's more wild fish coming into, more wild steelhead coming into Columbia than hatchery fish. 15,830 since April 1st past Bonneville Dam, only 10,830, so 5,000 more wild fish. Now that that ratio is going to shift here in the next month, but it is, the fisheries that have been in place have been focused on steelhead, and in June there was a two hatchery steelhead bag limit in the Columbia. That shifted to 1 as of July 1st, but that fishery is really going on the backs of the wild steelhead, which are listed. The department has proposed a series of conservation measures. They call it a closure. It's a retention closure, so that there's periods of time when you cannot keep even a hatchery steelhead. And of course, wild steelhead must be released unharmed. But what I want to talk about is the area, the use of cold water refugia in the Columbia. The fish will, once the river temperature is 68 degrees, and they have been above that for quite some time, they stay in cold water areas days and weeks, even a half a degree, 68.5, the research says those fish will stay there for weeks and months in cold water refugia. There's 23 really critical areas in the Columbia, and the Bonneville Pool has the majority of those. And in the Bonneville Pool, by the end of August, 90% of the fish in that area will be in the cold water refugia, which only make up 2% of that pool. I've referred to this as shooting fish in a barrel, which has been disputed, but if 90% of the fish are in 2% of the water, that is shooting fish in a barrel. The science is really abundantly clear on this. One of the other important elements is that the science also is there, the fish that actually use the cold water refugia, which is a recent adaptation in their migratory history, when they use that, what they're not seeing, what the research is showing is that we're not seeing the benefit of those fish staying in those areas. We're not seeing the benefit of their spawning success when they get to their natal home rivers. And the indication is that's because of the angling pressure that is occurring while those fish are in these areas for weeks and months. And the wild steelhead are being caught and released. Retention closures may reduce some of the effort, but those of you who are steelhead anglers know if you're allowed to go fishing, you will go fishing. And the old saw is 10% of the anglers catch 90% of the fish. Those are the anglers that are going out there. That includes me as well, although I've been going a lot less since about 2015. We would urge you to establish, and my time's up.
Yep.
May I have my minute over?
Finish your
Okay.
thought.
There's a number of things that commission can do. You're going to get a chance to talk about angling rule regulations later today. I know you can't take action at this exact moment. There's hoot owl closures that can be put in place. You probably are aware the department has already put into place emergency angling closures on the Umpqua due to water temperatures that are now 79 degrees. That's helpful. We wonder why it didn't happen a little bit earlier. But that's a good start. The department has been considering looking at a statewide permanent rule about this, and that process has dragged on and on and on. And that's why I'm here again and again and again. I appreciate being able to go over time, Chair Finley. I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you very much for the public forum opportunity. I greatly appreciate it.
Commissioner Buckmaster.
Thank you, David. As you well know, one of your most staunch supporters on this issue left the commission after our last meeting, Holly Atkinson. She read carefully everything that the Conservation Angler put out, plus she read the hot water reports that came out from Save Our Wild Salmon and that Columbia River Coalition, which I would advise all of our commissioners to read. She reviewed the EPA work that had been done. She led the work last year that put in with temporary rule a plan that had closures and created refugia based upon temperature, date and temperature. So when temperatures rose to a certain level, that there was a closure. We had the Deschutes, mouth of the Deschutes closure, and she isn't here now. What we have done since then is we made barbed hooks voluntary on the Columbia, which I don't think helps this if we are seeing repeated hooking of steelhead. I saw your number of 750 wild bee-run steelhead going over Bonneville, and then I looked at the Idaho numbers, and that number drops to 665 wild fish by the time they get to Idaho, so we're seeing a third drop there. We spent a long time yesterday listening to how we're going to have to manage the Columbia River on weak stock, and I can't imagine much weaker than 665 wild listed bee-run steelhead. So that was a long prelude to a short question. Did what we do last year have an impact, and is it something that you would recommend that we do? We ask our director to do this year with temporary rule.
Chair Finley, Commissioner Buckmaster, that's a very good question, and I think that the only evidence may be anecdotal because I'm not sure that we had a monitoring plan in place to really be able to test it. It's a very difficult, probably a very difficult thing for any staff, any biologist to figure out unless you have the plan in place before the action is taken. So I'd like to think it helped, and my conversations with anglers on the Deschutes it would indicate that it made a difference for the fish going up that river. But there's a lot of angling pressure in the Deschutes to kind of tell that story, and that has its own risks to these fish. Obviously, the area that was closed was a big area, and it made some people very unhappy who fish for Chinook, who claim that their use of particular gear and location they don't have encounters with steelhead, or they're very, very few. If you look at the size of the plume of the Deschutes, you have a little bit that goes upstream, but most of it goes downstream, and it's close. And it's similar to the issue that Jim Wells was talking about here. Salmon, the salmon or the steelhead and the sockeye are close to shore, which is why the tribal platform fishery catches more of them than they do of Chinook. A closure there could be tailored to protect steelhead, provide a modicum of protection for steelhead. It doesn't have to be as big. I think that was the other thing about that was a no fishing. It was a complete closure, so you couldn't fish at all, that I'd like to think that not exposing those fish to the stress of angling, fighting an angler, and then being released was a benefit at some point. There are certainly other ways. There's a lot more people concerned about this issue than just our group, and I think they have a variety of opinions about whether a sort of a retention closure as opposed to a no fishing area is helpful. We think that the no fishing area on these cold water refugia, given the impact of climate change, we're talking about 2 to 2.5 degrees centigrade increase, the trend here, and it's only going to get worse. And we don't have a plan yet to even protect that cold water in all these sources. But while the fish are there, it makes sense to release the pressure by not having angling in specific areas. And I think that we could define those, and we could pick them out. Oregon only has a couple, and we talked last year about Herman Creek. Obviously, there's a handicap ramp there, and so our disabled angler spot, and we didn't want to reduce that opportunity, but it is an important cold water refugia in Oregon. And hopefully, and I think that Chair Finley raised this issue with the Policy Review Committee yesterday about these, and Washington has a lot of them, and they're significantly, they're areas of a lot of fishing, and many of them are below Bonneville Dam. Sorry about that long answer, but you can designate an area that'd be appropriate. I appreciate that question.
Thank you, David. It was a long question. And so, Chair Finley, I hope, and I know you led the issue last year, supported the issue. We saw it we did talk as we got into it that maybe we had not done an effective job crafting the exact spatial closure because of the, and there are all kinds of issues with it, enforcement issues, all that. That said, I would ask you to somehow poll our commission to see if we want to move ahead with a similar plan that we had last year to try and protect these cold water refugia.
I'll do that, but Director, you have in the works, because we asked you to do a comprehensive closure for statewide waters, list of criteria, and then we delegate you the authority to do whenever necessary. Are we closer to that?
Chair Finley, I think the Fish Division has been working on that. I don't know exactly where they are in the process. I think, I find it, I'm just going to say this. I find it a little ironic that we're talking about a quote-unquote conservation closure at the mouth of the Deschutes, which we did implement last year, but then we're hearing at the same time criticism that it was too big. Our conservation closure was too large. I find that a little bit of a mixed message. That, we went with a closure last year that was easy to interpret, that was line of sight, so that we didn't have essentially a curvilinear boundary line for the closed area. That's an important factor when it comes to actually enforcing the regulation. We're we're certainly able to do that again this year. I think, I'm not sure if Chris Kern is here in the room, but there is a large number of other rolling closures in place. And I think Mr. Moskowitz was alluding to those. There are other closures in place through these reservoirs that, that are basically a response to low abundance, that make the cold water refugia closure somewhat moot if you have these larger blocked areas closed. So
Well,
I don't know all the
I hope
details.
you understand that none of us, we have all supported what you did. Did you get some other sense?
Well, I just heard Commissioner Buckmaster mention that he thought it was perhaps too large of a closed area. I don't know. Maybe I'm putting words in his mouth. So I don't want
it
to
is one of
debate
my
it, but-
goals in life, Director, to minimize the times that I am ironic. So, in order to clear that up, I will say I am interested in a closure which will maximize the protection for the bee-run steelhead and other steelhead that stay in a cold water refugia for extended lengths of time. But if your fish biologists are accurate in what they tell us, that the Chinook do not spend long periods of time in the cold water refugia, so the chances of them being hooked multiple times are minimal, and that they go more on the Washington side. The idea of truncating and allowing fishing primarily targeting Chinook that are not using the cold water refugia to the degree that the steelhead are, while protecting the steelhead. It may appear ironic, but I was just trying to tailor it to meet the needs. If you want to do the whole thing and take the heat, I'm all for it. We can close a much larger area, and I'll happily vote for it.
Hang on just a minute, David.
Yes.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as I understand our process, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't make decisions with public comment, but we can bring them up later on, and I hope we do that. And so I think David Moskowitz makes a valid point. My question is going to be, I want to hear from staff, the fishery staff, whether they have a viewpoint on this issue. And then also, I would have a question about, well, if we're doing it on the Umpqua with an emergency closure, what makes this different? So, but I'd like to have that discussion later in the day if the chair would allow.
For background, we did a sense of the commission that we wanted the director to develop criteria statewide where the staff or the director sees a need for conservation purposes to make these closures. I mean, they've been doing them before. They're fisheries biologists, they understand it. So what Commissioner Buckmaster is, I think, expressing is a sense of urgency in some of these areas, and to indicate again the backing of the commission that we need to make these conservation closures with warm waters. And
But do we do that at this
well,
right
see,
now?
we're not making a regulation that requires compliance with the administrative.
So you're just asking for a
So I'm
sense of-
going to ask you in a few minutes, after David responds, to just give a sense to the commission that, you know, this is the way you feel and want to back the department on these kind of decisions.
Okay, I'm not sure I can give you a sense without hearing staff's perspective. I want to make sure that I don't just hear one side of the story. I want to make sure that I hear.
Okay, then you should abstain.
Okay.
But I will ask the remaining members. Okay, David, you wanted to make a comment.
I just wanted to make sure that we use the right language. There's a closure to all fishing, and then there's a retention closure, and sometimes those things get mixed up. I think it's really important to make sure we identify where they are closures and where there are retention closures. And I to just respond to Kurt and to the staff, we were very supportive of that action last summer, and we think it was, and we applauded that, and we were appreciative of it. And so I hope that you know that we have no criticism about that, but just want to make that clear. And, but just want to make sure we use the right language when people talk about closure versus a retention closure.
We'll
That's
leave
important.
that to the director and the staff to do. So, commissioners, if you'd like to express your strong support of this continued work by the department, these necessary closures, then just show me your hand. Okay. All right. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Very good. Mr. Chair, that brings us to our last public forum commenter. Mr. Carson Brown wants to talk with you about proposed 2020 traditional archery seasons.
Welcome, Mr. Brown.
Chair Finley, Commission members, Director Melcher. My name is Carson Brown. I'm from Staten, Oregon, and I'm the Secretary for the Traditional Archers of Oregon, representing that group today. So, I want to thank you for allowing us this time to reiterate our proposals in the 2020 Big Game Regulation process. We hope that the Commission and the Big Game Simplification Committee has seen the importance of our proposals via the public comment that's been coming in through the local meetings, as well as the letters. We've gotten a lot of feedback suggesting that there's been a lot of public comment regarding the traditional archery hunting proposals in favor of them. We feel like this is a bigger sign of not just the growing popularity of traditional archery, but the growing concern around the technology that has crept into our that's crept into our hunting seasons in the last 25 years. We live in a time of trail cameras that send pictures instantly to our smartphones, rangefinders built into binoculars, gun scopes, and even bow sights, Bluetooth aeronauts, thermal imaging equipment, Google Earth, personal drones, bows that shoot accurately out to 100 yards, rifles that shoot accurately out to 1,000 yards. A growing number of hunters and conservationists recognize it is imperative to restrict ourselves in our use of technology in hunting if we want to maintain hunting opportunity. It might be a good time to point out that overcrowded general seasons are another form of loss of hunting opportunity. Oregon archery seasons were greatly expanded in the 80s in an effort to ease hunter crowding in rifle season. It worked. Possibly it worked too well. The traditional archers of Oregon feel that expanding to more of these traditional archery seasons is a very simple way to take a step in the right direction, to continue the great opportunity of having long archery seasons without having a big impact on the game we hunt. If you look at the general season success rates in Idaho's elk management plan, the archery success rates have increased from around 3% in 1982 to nearly 18% in 2012, which is comparable to the general rifle season success rate. This is not what our primitive archery seasons were designed for. We know from talking to the biologists around the state of Oregon that the modern bows are having a similar impact here in Oregon. So please consider the expansion of our Canyon Creek traditional hunt to the entire general archery season rather than eliminating it. Our strong archery heritage should be highlighted, where it can be used as a recruiting tool to attract new hunters that are attracted to the challenge and high ethic of traditional bow hunting. We're excited about the new North Fork John Day Wilderness proposal. However, at 50 tags, we feel that this misses the point of traditional bow hunting opportunity. There's a lot more opportunity that could be provided given the low success rate of traditional archery equipment. For the same reason, we feel the Trout Creek traditional hunt should be made a general season traditional hunt. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Commissioners, comments? Commissioner Wall.
Quick question.
Yes.
This is coming up in next month in Gold Beach. These, are you here today because you're not there you can't go to
I'm
Gold
going to be
Beach?
in Alaska on a moose hunt float, first time, heading north, so, yeah.
Okay. Any,
With a wooden bow and arrows.
Say with a bow?
Yeah.
Wow.
Homemade.
Any other questions for commissioners? You know, I think we've had this discussion, at least among ourselves, about this creeping technology. Obviously, the bow season was set aside as a form of more primitive hunting, to give wildlife a sporting chance
Yes.
And I've seen the evolution in my life. And so when you propose this kind of area, are you thinking about where do we draw the line? Like, you know, first there were long bows, then there were recurve bows, and then there's compound bows. And so where in that chain of technology do we think about a primitive weapon?
Well, I think it makes sense to go back to when our general archery seasons were first established and look at the equipment that was around at that time. And for those that are hunting, say, the trout creeks with traditional archery equipment right now, that equipment hasn't really changed since the establishment of our first archery seasons. It's, you know, there's slight changes in the, you know, materials in the bows and the arrows, but really in terms of their effectiveness, their effective range, you know, we're still looking at 30 yards an end. That hasn't changed. And so basically, you know, wheels on the end of the bow limb is pretty much the line. So.
All right. Commissioner Wall, you look like you'd like to ask a question, but you're not sure.
Well, maybe I would.
Okay.
Just to be clear, you're saying that that compound bows would not be included because they can go 80 yards or 100 yards or whatever?
Yeah, that's, and you know, we talk about this technology creep, but lately it feels more like a tidal wave. So originally when the compound bow came on the scene, it expanded that effective range to, you know, 40 or 50 yards, which was pretty cool, and everybody was picking them up, and hey, look at this, you know, my buddy's killing everything now, and then it just kept getting more advanced where, you know, now you can reach out to 60, 65 yards, you know, 70 yards, and it's the whole accoutrement of technology surrounding it. It's the advancement in sights, the advancement in the amount of let off. I mean, the cam design, the whole design of the thing has evolved, and range finders in combination with the bow and arrow itself. So it's not uncommon to hear amongst other hunters, you know, wildlife being taken during archery season at 100 plus yards. It's not uncommon anymore, and it's not what our seasons were, you know, intended for.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Carson.
Thanks.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, we have 23 temporary rules that need ratification. I know you're planning on taking a break either prior to or after. I do have one little note, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have on any of these rules. But I have one little note just for the record I wanted to clarify on the
Okay.
very